Incest falls under the taboo umbrella as it is frowned upon legally, among religious communities, and across cultures. Incestuous marriages were widespread in the Greco-Roman period of Egyptian history. Countless Roman census declarations and papyri show that many husbands and wives were brothers and sisters. Sexual relations between close relatives, or incest, is typically seen as socially and biologically prohibited. Organisms can improve the genetic variety of their progeny and boost their chances of survival and successful reproduction by mating with individuals who are not members of their own family. The oldest indications of incest restrictions date back to the prehistoric period. According to archaeological evidence, early Homo sapiens avoided inbreeding, most likely because it would have negatively impacted the health of their progeny. This was a survival tactic, since inbreeding could result in the blending of detrimental genetic features, decreasing the population's overall fitness. Setting defined guidelines for sexual relationships became more crucial as people moved from small nomadic groups to bigger, stable communities. The emergence of the incest taboo served as a mechanism for controlling these interactions, maintaining social order and community growth, and significantly contributing to the formation of kinship networks. The societies construct intricate family networks by determining who is and is not allowed to marry, which in turn aids in the formation of alliances and cooperative relationships between various groups. The ban on incest was not only a legal restriction, but also a deeply embedded social norm in many countries. Myths, folklore, and religious teachings that portrayed incest as a serious moral evil frequently served to sustain this norm. These cultural practices ensured that the taboo against incest was upheld for generations by forcing it into society's collective awareness. By the way, this activity is not as uncommon in the animal realm as one might suppose. A lot of animals take a bit too much pleasure in the affection of their close companions, and often this isn't their choice. Rather, it's what they have to do. For example, the cheetah is recognized for having little genetic variety because of a population bottleneck that happened about 12,000 years ago. People became highly linked to one another as a result, which frequently resulted in inbreeding. Cheetahs appear to have evolved coping methods to deal with the possible side effects of incest, as evidenced by their continued survival and growth in spite of this. It gets even more bizarre in the realm of aquatic life. Asexual reproduction occurs in the Amazon molly fish species through a mechanism known as gynogenesis, in which the female's eggs develop into children without the need for male sperm fertilization. As a result, each Amazon molly is basically a genetic replica of its mother, producing children that are genetically similar to their mums. For example, incest is widespread among insects. It is well known that incestuous mating occurs between red flower beetles, or Tribolium castaneum as they are formally called. The preference of female beetles to mate with their siblings rather than unrelated males is believed to reduce the likelihood of acquiring sexually transmitted infections. The animals in each of these cases have developed defense mechanisms against the detrimental impacts of inbreeding, highlighting the diversity and complexity of reproductive tactics across the animal kingdom. Referring back to human sibling affection, incest has been practiced from the earliest civilizations in ancient Mesopotamia. This method was frequently used as a political tactic to keep power within a single family or dynasty, especially among the ruling classes. One of the oldest civilizations in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians, recorded instances of incestuous unions from the city-state of Ur as early as the 3rd millennium BC. When the royal tombs of Ur were discovered in the 1920s, King Meskalumdug and his sister Queen were found interred there. However, incestuous customs were not exclusive to the royal houses. Legal records from the Old Babylonian era suggest that commoners were also involved in incestuous unions. One of the world's oldest and most extensively deciphered books, the Code of Hammurabi, did not specifically forbid incestuous couplings, indicating that these unions were socially acceptable. Moreover, incestuous couplings between gods were frequently described in Mesopotamian mythology. For instance, the Enuma Elish, a Babylonian creation tale, describes the union of the sky god Anu and his sister, the earth goddess Kai. Such mystical frameworks might have provided theological justification for incestuous behavior. However, marriages between brothers and sisters, and between parents and children, are recorded on Assyrian law tablets from the 1st millennium BC. These rules were more complex and included a distinction between full and half siblings. If two half-siblings did not share a mother with the full siblings, they could not get married. The prevalence of royal incest was higher in the Neo-Assyrian age. This may have been an attempt to uphold the purity and strengthen the royal line's claim to the throne. As an illustration, it is known that the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal wed his sister. The Assyrian nobility most likely engaged in this practice frequently. Compared to the Sumerians and Assyrians, the Akkadian Empire, which flourished in the 24th century BC, appears to have had stricter rules prohibiting incest. The Eshnunna legal system, which existed before the Hammurabi system, specifically prohibited marriages between siblings and between parents and children. This suggests that attitudes toward incest varied significantly between Mesopotamian eras and civilizations. Despite these variations, it is clear that incestuous practices were important to ancient Mesopotamian culture and were strongly associated with political, religious, and social mores. The late Bronze Age Hittite Empire, which comprised parts of modern-day Turkey and Syria, also practiced incest extensively. Hittite regulations from the 16th century BC make it clear that the state not only approved, but actively managed incestuous relationships. The rules prescribe different punishments for incestuous relationships based on the degree of connection. Parent-child unions were subject to the worst sanctions. Despite this, the Hittite royal family was exempt from these laws. For instance, the Hittite monarch Mursili II was married to his sister. This double norm suggests even more that the ruling classes used incest, like they did in other Mesopotamian societies, to preserve the chastity of the royal line and to strengthen their hold on power. When marrying their sisters or daughters was a political and spiritual requirement for pharaohs, it was believed that the pharaoh's divine status was preserved by these incestuous couplings. King Tutankhamun's incestuous marriage is the most well-known example. His parents were siblings, according to 2010 DNA testing on his mummified bones. The pharaohs weren't the only people to have incestuous relationships, though. The Greek-born Ptolemaic dynasty likewise established political control through this manner. Cleopatra VII, the most famous delegate, married each of her younger brothers in turn. However, the practice was not as widespread among the general population. Aristocrats were usually the only ones to enter into incestuous relationships. The majority of people marry within their social class, sometimes to someone who is not related to them directly. The acceptance of incest was greatly influenced by the religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. In the Egyptian pantheon, sibling couples such as Osiris and Isis, who were brothers and brides, were commonplace. This divine model served as the theological justification for the pharaoh's marriages to their siblings or other close relatives. Even in the presence of these protections, incestuous marriages had significant biological consequences. For instance, King Tutankhamun's serious health issues, which were probably caused by inbreeding, included malaria and clubfoot. After a short life, he died at the age of 19. With time, the negative effects of inbreeding grow more and more apparent. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a number of health issues and died young. Ptolemy II married his whole sister, a tradition that persisted for a number of years and led to a weaker lineage. The last Ptolemaic empress, Cleopatra II, was an inbred. Her son, Caesarion, by Julius Caesar, was a child of an outside marriage. The deteriorating health of the ruling class was not the only consequence of incestuous marriages. Furthermore, the practice wove a convoluted web of familial ties that often resulted in arguments and power battles. A serious issue was caused by the periodic power conflicts between multiple claims for the throne. Consequently, periods of instability and civil unrest ensued, finally culminating in the downfall of the dynasties. By the time the Romans and Ptolemaic dynasty invaded Egypt, incestuous connections among the nobility had largely disappeared. The Romans' strict prohibitions against incest prevented them from carrying out this practice. However, the political stability of the kingdom and the genetic well-being of the royal line had already suffered due to the history of incestuous marriages in ancient Egypt. And so, a smooth segue to the intricate and varied topic of incest in ancient Rome. We must first examine the Roman definition of marriage in order to comprehend it. In Roman civilization, matrimony was strictly prohibited, and and could only be formed between unrelated individuals. Regulations like the 12 Tables, which are Rome's first codified laws and date back to the 5th century BC, were used to enforce this standard. Still, the meaning of closely linked changed over time. At first, cousin weddings were forbidden, but later, this restriction was removed. One distinctive feature of the Roman agnatic kinship system was that ties could only be traced back through the male line. This implied that, in theory, if a man and his sister had different fathers, he may marry her. This system is not without controversy, just like any other. For example, it is well known that there was a great deal of controversy across the nation when Emperor Claudius married his niece. The fact that Claudius had to amend the legislation to permit this union shows how pliable Roman law could be. Moreover, it was thought that the chief priest's spouses and daughters were the Roman Vestal virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta. Their symbolic incestuous relationship with the senior priest was an important part of their religious role, even though they were obliged to uphold a vow of celibacy. This meant that a man may theoretically marry his sister even though their fathers were not the same. Like any other system, this one is not without dispute. For instance, it is commonly known that Emperor Claudius's marriage to his niece caused a great lot of controversy throughout the country. The flexibility of Roman law is demonstrated by the fact that Claudius had to change the rule in order to allow for this union. Furthermore, it was believed that the Roman Vestal virgins, priestesses of the goddess Vesta, were the chief priest's wife and daughters. Despite being required to maintain a vow of celibacy, their symbolic incestuous relationship with the senior priest was a significant aspect of their religious role. The ancient Persians were less harsh on incest than the Romans were. One of the earliest known monotheistic faiths, Zoroastrianism, had its roots in ancient Persia and was characterized by self-marriage or next-of-kin marriages, which are forms of incest. Xwedada is the name of this custom, which entailed the marriage of parents and siblings as well as their offspring. Such unions, according to the Zoroastrians, strengthened spiritual ties and drew them nearer to their god, Ahura Mazda. Religious literature like the Vendidad, one of the main texts of the Zoroastrian religion, even supported the practice. It is important to note, nevertheless, that historians continue to disagree over the scope and frequency of Xwedada in ancient Persian culture. Some contend that the practice was not as pervasive as the texts imply. One of the most advanced and powerful pre-Columbian societies in America, the Inca Empire, also practiced incestuous marriages, especially among its nobility. The Incas held a similar belief to that of the ancient Egyptians, that their royal bloodline should remain pure. The ruler Sapa Inca frequently wed his sister. The Incas held that the sun god Inti was the ancestor of their monarchs. Furthermore, they were able to preserve their divine lineage through these incestuous unions. Nonetheless, this custom was limited to the royal family, and it was severely forbidden for commoners to wed close relatives. The subject of incest, especially among the royal and noble classes, has been both fascinating and taboo in Chinese history. The concept of Zhongdi Hun, or brother-sister marriage, was prevalent throughout the Shang dynasty, when the earliest documented cases can be found. On the other hand, the Zhou dynasty, which succeeded the Shang, instituted the Rites of Zhou, a manual that governed social mores and conduct. With the explicit prohibition of marriages between close relatives, this treaty brought about a dramatic change in the way society saw incest. The Confucian philosophy, which gained popularity during this time, emphasized the value of upholding appropriate relationships within the family structure and further reinforced these bans. Incestuous relationships continued in the top classes of society despite these developments, frequently due to personal ambition or political necessity. For instance, Emperor Wen is rumored to have wed his half-sister in an attempt to strengthen his claim to the throne during the Han dynasty, which lasted from 200 BC to 200 AD. The legal ban against incestuous unions was further strengthened under the Song dynasty. Marriages between people who were related by a common ancestor within 5 generations were expressly forbidden under Ming dynasty legislation. Later, under the Qing dynasty, this law was extended to encompass those who had a common ancestor within 7 generations. But even with these strict regulations, there were sometimes exceptions made for the royal family. To preserve the integrity of the royal bloodline, for instance, Emperor Kangxi arranged for his son Yongjiang to wed his cousin during the Qing dynasty. The custom of Tungyang Evith, or child brides reared as prospective spouses for their adopted brothers, spread throughout rural areas in the late Qing period. Because there was no blood relation between the participants, this activity was considered a type of pseudo-incest despite not being literally incestuous. It is important to remember, though, that these were the exceptions rather than the rule, and that they were frequently criticized historically and by the public. Incestuous partnerships have long been frowned upon in Chinese society as a whole. Now let's talk about the island nation of Japan. Many examples of incestuous relationships, especially amongst celestial beings, can be found in the 8th century Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, the oldest known chronicles of Japanese civilization. Izanagi, who also fathered the moon god Tsukuyomi and the storm goddess Susanoo with his sister Izanami, was the one who gave birth to the sun goddess Amaterasu from his left eye. The maintenance of purity served as the justification for these celestial incestuous unions. The gods were viewed as pure beings in Shinto theology, and their incestuous relationships were justified as an attempt to preserve this purity. Up to the 6th century, sibling and parent-child marriages were prevalent in the imperial household, reflecting this ideology. But when the title code was introduced in 701 AD, things changed. It reflected a wider shift in society by outlawing unions of close relatives within the imperial family. Incestuous partnerships decreased during the Heian period, 794–1185, due to the adoption of Chinese Confucian values, which placed an emphasis on respect and familial hierarchy. However, the practice was not completely outlawed. To maintain their position of authority and prestige, the nobility in particular kept being married incestuously. The nobility's habit of incestuous marriages served as a means of power consolidation during the Edo era. But social mores were shifting. The Tokugawa shogunate, which ruled from 1603 to 1868, enforced stringent moral laws based on Confucian ideals in an effort to keep social order and regulate the samurai class. These values were thought to be broken by incestuous relationships. Laws were enacted by the shogunate to forbid unions of close relatives, even of commoners. Severe penalties were applied to implement these rules, which included property confiscation and exile. However, the practice of incest persisted in isolated rural areas where the shogunate's influence was limited. Close relatives continued to get married. These were frequently motivated by pragmatic factors, like the necessity to retain family property and the scarcity of acceptable marriage partners. The Meiji Restoration in 1868 was a pivotal moment. Christian morality and Western concepts started to permeate Japanese society. The new administration aimed to bring Japan up to date and conform to Western standards. The Meiji Civil Code, which forbade incestuous unions, was passed in 1872. Nonetheless, compared to the West, the definition of incest was more limited. Cousin marriages were accepted and sometimes promoted as a way to deepen family bonds. In the 20th century, Japan's views on incest continued to evolve. Western concepts gained more traction, and as a result, social norms changed. Although they were still allowed, cousin marriages started to become less common. This was caused by a number of things, such as rising awareness of the possible health problems connected with near-related marriages, and more mobility, which extended the pool of potential marriage partners. Another notable transition occurred after World War II. In an effort to democratize Japanese society, the Allied occupation imposed new laws and a constitution. Although incestuous marriages were still forbidden by the new Civil Code of 1947, the term was defined to cover connections between in-laws and step-relatives. There were nevertheless cases of incestuous relationships in spite of these legal restrictions, especially in popular culture and literature. These portrayals frequently aim to investigate taboo topics and question social conventions. The Japanese government took action to combat the problem of incest, especially child abuse, inside families in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. To safeguard victims, new legislation were passed and support networks were established. These initiatives are a reflection of an increasing understanding of the harm that incest causes and a desire to stop it. The reporting and prevention of incestuous abuse might be hampered by cultural factors, such as a high emphasis on family privacy and a reluctance to involve outsiders in family affairs despite these advancements. Furthermore, compared to many Western nations, Japan's legal definition of incest is still more restrictive. One example of how past customs continue to have an impact is the legality of cousin marriages. The Dharma Shastras, a collection of ancient Hindu writings, offer comprehensive rules on family and social interactions in the Indian subcontinent. These rules forbid incest. One of the most significant books, the Manusmriti, expressly prohibits incestuous relationships and imposes harsh penalties for those who violate it. According to these writings, Sapinda ties encompass not just blood kin, but also links through marriage and people with a shared ancestor. It was extremely banned for members of the Sapinda relationships to get married. Religious teachings were not the only things that shaped Indian society's anti-incest laws and social norms. Local customs and traditions also played a significant role. Notwithstanding these differences, the taboo against incest persisted in all societal classes among India. Let's go on to the Middle Ages, a time span spanning from the 5th to the 15th century that was marked by intricate family ties and substantial social change. During the Middle Ages, incestuous relationships were prevalent, especially between royal families. The family's desire to maintain its possessions and authority was the main driver behind this. Getting married inside the family guaranteed that titles, fortunes, and estates would stay in the same family. The great European family known as the Habsburgs, who dominated numerous regions from the 13th to the 20th century, also engaged in this activity. The Church, on the other hand, disapproved of these unions, seeing them as immoral and contrary to natural principles. Many royal families persisted in having incestuous marriages in spite of the Church's stance, which sadly led to many health problems as well as complicated family trees. For instance, generations of inbreeding resulted in a hereditary malformation known as the Habsburg jaw, which affected the Habsburgs. A change in perspectives regarding incestuous relationships also occurred during the Middle Ages, especially in Europe. The Church was becoming more and more powerful, and its opposition to incestuous unions was becoming more vocal. The Church's position was founded on biblical teachings that denounced incest as a serious transgression. The biggest shift occurred in the 12th century when Pope Innocent III called for the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. The council ruled that, as opposed to the previous 7 degrees of ancestry, marriages were only forbidden up to the 4th degree. The practical challenges of implementing the 7-degree rule, which frequently required in-depth genealogical knowledge, led to this modification. Despite the Church's best efforts, incestuous unions persisted, frequently with the Church's implicit blessing. Sometimes, for social or political reasons, the Church would give dispensations that permitted close cousins to get married. The aristocracy was frequently granted these dispensations, which solidified the custom among the governing classes. The Church faced criticism for its views on incestuous unions. The validity of the dispensations and the prohibitions were topics of discussion within the Church. There were many who claimed the Church was too liberal, and others who thought it was too conservative. In spite of the Church's stated attitude, a large number of cardinals and bishops are descended from noble families, and they frequently utilize their positions to serve the interests of their families. To consolidate authority and money, this included arranging marriages between close families. Church rules were frequently broken or ignored, which fostered a culture of corruption and favoritism inside the organization. This was not an issue exclusive to the Catholic Church. Despite its unique history and customs, the Orthodox Church also experienced cases of clergy members having incestuous relationships. The causes were comparable: the concentration of money and power inside the family. The Church's participation in incestuous unions caused a problem of credibility. The credibility and moral authority of the Church were harmed. The mounting demands for reform inside the Church, which culminated in the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century, were influenced by this circumstance. The Church's views on marriage and its procedures were significantly altered during the Reformation, particularly the ban on incestuous unions. Power dynamics changed as nation governments emerged, and feudalism declined. The necessity to keep riches and power within the family decreased as the nobility's influence waned. As a result, marriages based on political alliances became more common, often involving families from different regions or countries. The church also started to educate the public about the dangers of incestuous relationships, including the health risks and the moral implications. Despite the decline, incestuous marriages did not disappear entirely. They persisted, albeit less regularly, and were frequently the focus of controversy and scandal. These unions were becoming perceived as a thing of the past, disconnected from the shifting moral and societal standards. The fall of incestuous unions during the Middle Ages signaled a profound change in the way society viewed marriage and the family. This change paved the way for today's conception of marriage, which is centered on love and mutual agreement rather than riches and power. Yes, exactly. The Arthurian legend of Mordred, the illegitimate son of King Arthur and his half-sister Morgause, is another example of medieval literature that emphasizes the terrible effects of incest. Because of Mordred's betrayal, Arthur's kingdom falls, further solidifying the taboo and unfavorable image. From the Greek tragedy of Oedipus Rex to contemporary works like George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, incest has been a recurrent theme in literature and popular culture. Incestuous relationships have been portrayed in various contexts, often highlighting the societal and moral implications of such relationships. The taboo on incest has also impacted morality and religious beliefs. As a transgression of divine law, incestuous relationships are expressly forbidden by several religions. These bans are frequently upheld by religious texts, practices, and teachings that characterize incest as a serious moral sin. Examining the biblical account of human creation serves as the first step in understanding the history of incest in Christianity. The first book of the Bible, Genesis, tells us that God created Adam and Eve, the ancestors of humans. Cain and Abel, their offspring, are the earliest siblings in human history to be documented. God banishes Cain and takes him to the land of Nod, which is located east of Eden, after he kills Abel out of jealousy. The Bible says that Cain was acquainted with his wife, who became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Given that Adam and Eve were the first humans and that their only other kid had died, this begs the important question of where Cain's wife came from. Christians who study the Bible agree that Cain's wife was one of Adam and Eve's later offspring. This suggests that incestuous connections were essential to the spread of the human race. The fact that Genesis 5:4 mentions that Adam and Eve had more sons and girls lends more credence to this interpretation. This implies that in order to preserve their survival, the earliest human generations were forced to get into incestuous partnerships. Looking deeper into the story, we find that the biblical account of Lot and his daughters contains one more incidence of incest. Lot, a virtuous man who lived in Sodom, flees with his two daughters from the city's impending destruction. Lot's daughters plan to make their father intoxicated and have a sexual relationship with him in order to maintain their family line because they thought they were the last people on earth. The progenitors of the Moabite and Ammonite nations, respectively, were Moab and Ben-Ammi, the children of these incestuous marriages. Later on, in the book of Leviticus, the Bible expressly forbids incest, suggesting a change in social mores brought about by the growing human population. This restriction is in line with Christian beliefs that promote the value of respecting boundaries in familial relationships and the sacredness of the family. The Islamic holy book, the Quran, establishes limitations for incestuous relationships by clearly defining the degrees of kinship that are forbidden for marriage. One of the Quran's chapters, Surah An-Nisa, clearly prohibits marriages between those who are related by blood, such as parents and their offspring, siblings and relationships formed via breastfeeding, or milk kinship. These prohibitions are further reinforced by the hadiths, which are the sayings and deeds of Prophet Muhammad. These prohibitions are rigorously enforced by Islamic regulations, or Sharia, which are based on the Quran and hadiths and govern every aspect of a Muslim's life, including family and marital interactions. Under Islamic law, transgressions are regarded as serious sins and are subject to punishment. These religious teachings provide the basis of Islamic culture's social norms and laws against incest. Irrespective of cultural or regional variations, the ban on incest is a universal characteristic of all Islamic communities. Hindu mythology tells an engrossing story since it is full of intricate stories and personalities. The universe and all living things, including Saraswati, who was born of Brahma's own body, were created in the beginning. Brahma was enthralled with Saraswati's beauty and intelligence, since she was the epitome of wisdom and understanding. Due to Brahma's intense love for Saraswati, their union was contentious. The other gods did not approve of this deed, especially Shiva, who was infuriated by Brahma's incestuous actions. As retribution for Brahma's transgression, Shiva severed the head of one of his 5 heads. This story is significant in the context of Hindu mythology, despite its scandalous nature, as fundamental components of the cosmic cycle, creation and wisdom, are fused in the marriage of Brahma and Saraswati. One of the oldest civilizations in Africa, the Ashanti, had a long history of viewing incestuous relationships as serious sins. According to the Ashanti, these kinds of connections upended the social and spiritual order and resulted in harsh penalties for violators. Incestuous unions were likewise strongly discouraged among the Zulu and Xhosa people of southern Africa. Sexual connections were strictly regulated in ancient societies, and violating the regulations might result in social exclusion and harsh punishments. It's important to realize, though, that these customs and beliefs weren't shared by everyone on the continent. Because of the continent's size and cultural diversity, views on incest differed widely between African societies. As time went on, the arrival of colonial rule in Africa significantly altered cultural norms, particularly those pertaining to incest. Colonial powers ignored regional customs and traditions in favor of imposing their own moral and legal systems on the populations they governed. As part of this, Western laws against incest were introduced. These laws were frequently harsher than those that already existed in many African civilizations. These new laws occasionally caused conflicts with regional customs. For example, cousin marriages were customarily accepted in various regions of East Africa. But these partnerships were forbidden because they were deemed incestuous during the British colonial era. Conflict and opposition were frequently the results of imposing laws and customs from abroad. African societies have embraced or rejected these changes, depending on the situation, which resulted in tensions that persist in the post-colonial period. In Africa, the incest problem is still complicated. Numerous things, such as societal standards, legal frameworks, religious convictions, and cultural traditions, have an impact on it. The influence of religion on views about incest is noteworthy in Africa. The 2 main religions of the continent, Islam and Christianity, both forbid incestuous unions. Many African nations' legal codes now include these religious bans, which serve to further institutionalize social taboos against incest. However, there are differences in various countries' implementation of these rules. In certain places, incest laws are vigorously enforced, while in most others, they are completely disregarded. Many variables, such as variations in legal systems, degrees of law enforcement, and social perceptions of the law, might be blamed for this disparity. Furthermore, the occurrence of forced marriage and underage marriage in various regions of Africa further complicates the incest issue. Since these practices frequently entail interactions between close relatives, many legal systems view them as incestuous. Numerous obstacles stand in the way of efforts to address the incest problem in Africa. The dearth of information regarding the prevalence of incest is one of the primary obstacles. It is challenging to gauge the scope of the issue and create workable solutions because of the dearth of data. And further obstacle is the shame attached to incest. It frequently keeps incest victims from reporting instances. Furthermore, it may result in the victims' expulsion from their communities. There are also legal challenges. Although there are laws prohibiting incest in many African nations, they are sometimes poorly enforced, and the severity of the punishments is not usually commensurate with the offense. There are further complexities due to the fact that different legal definitions of incest exist. There has been development in spite of these obstacles. International organizations and non-governmental groups are attempting to increase public awareness of the problem, offer assistance to victims, and push for improved legislation and enforcement. Additionally, governments are starting to take the problem more seriously. Some have even introduced laws and penalties that are stiffer. Strict social standards and legislation prohibiting incest were also prevalent among the indigenous societies of Australia and New Zealand in the Pacific region. For example, the intricate kinship systems of the Australian Aboriginal tribes outline the relationships among various tribal members. Marriages between close relatives were forbidden in these kinship systems, which are frequently founded on totemic beliefs. Violations were frequently punishable by death and were seen as grave breaches of the social order. Similar strong bans against incest were in place for the Maori people of New Zealand. These restrictions were frequently enforced under the notion of tapu, a type of sacred constraint. Incest was seen as a transgression of tapu and was associated with bad luck or catastrophe. These indigenous tribes in the Americas shared the taboo against incest despite differences in culture and geography. The indigenous peoples of pre-Columbian eras had particular laws around incest. For example, the Iroquois had a matrilineal descent system. Matrimonial unions within a clan, traced back via the female line, were strictly prohibited as they were deemed incestuous. But major changes occurred with the advent of European colonists in the 15th and 16th centuries. The colonizers imposed their own cultural norms and regulations, particularly those relating to incest. This led to a shift in the indigenous society's perspective of incest, resulting in the taboo that is present today. As the European influence spread, so did the imposition of its laws and norms. Regarding incest, the Catholic Church had strict beliefs. They considered it a serious sin that may result in death or excommunication. The Native American social norms were changed when these ideas were imposed upon them. For instance, the legal code known as the Siete Partidas, which was enacted by the Spanish colonists, defined incestuous relationships very liberally. It forbade unions between relatives within 4 degrees of consanguinity, which meant that third cousins were not allowed to wed. This stood in sharp contrast to the customs of many indigenous tribes, which frequently permitted cousin marriages. These European standards permeated American society significantly over time. The stern bans on incest were integrated into the legal frameworks of the recently established American states. By the late 19th century, incestuous marriages were illegal in every state in the U.S., with fines, jail time, and, in extreme circumstances, the death sentence. These legal restrictions prevented the genetic problems linked to marriages between close relatives, while also reflecting the taboo against incest that had grown out of European influence. These statutes have survived until the current era because of their dual intent. Growing knowledge of genetics and heredity over the 20th century strengthened social and legal bans against incest. According to studies, children born into close family marriages were more likely to acquire deleterious recessive genes, which raised the likelihood of genetic problems in their descendants. Incestuous relationships were stigmatized even more by this scientific data, which not only made them socially and medically taboo, but also discouraged them. Nonetheless, there has been ongoing change in the meaning and understanding of incest. States in the US have different laws. Some forbid marriages between first cousins, while others permit them. The continuous argument over where the line should be drawn is reflected in this contradiction. Cousin marriages are more common in various South American nations, like Brazil and Argentina. Though still very low when compared to worldwide averages, these countries have a greater rate of cousin marriages. Throughout history, a number of notable intellectuals have expressed interest in the taboo of incest. The controversial Oedipus complex theory, put out by psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, contends that young boys inherently develop sexual cravings for their mothers and rivalry with their fathers. Freud claimed that the incest taboo developed out of the need to suppress these unconscious urges. Freud's idea has, nevertheless, drawn a lot of criticism and is currently not commonly acknowledged. Because it better fits our understanding of human behavior and development, modern psychologists and anthropologists prefer to choose the Westermarck effect as a more reasonable explanation for the taboo against incest. The Westermarck effect, which postulates that people who grow up together in close proximity throughout early childhood develop desensitized to sexual attraction towards one another, was first hypothesized in the field of evolutionary psychology in the 20th century. This idea, put forth by Finnish anthropologist Edvard Westermarck, offered yet another explanation for the taboo around incest by speculating that it might be an adapted psychological defense mechanism against inbreeding. The taboo on incest, according to another well-known philosopher, Friedrich Engels, suggests that early human societies practiced a kind of group marriage in which all members of the society were wedded to one another. He said that our tribal civilizations evolved from basic to sophisticated due to the ban on incest. The scientific study of genetics started offering a biological rationale for the taboo against incest in the 19th century. From a scientific perspective, genes are sections of DNA that contain the instructions needed to make proteins, which are the fundamental units of our bodies. Half of our DNA come from our father and the other half from our mother. These genes work together to form a distinct genetic blueprint that affects our physical characteristics as well as some behavioral features. Nonetheless, the gene pool is greatly reduced by the procreation of close cousins. This raises the possibility that children will receive identical gene variants from both parents, a state called homozygosity. If the inherited gene is dangerous or faulty, homozygosity can be detrimental and increase the chance of genetic illnesses. Numerous genetic abnormalities that are more prone to occur in children born from incestuous relationships have been uncovered by genetic science. These include sickle cell anemia, Tay-Sachs disease, and cystic fibrosis, which are all brought on by inheriting two defective copies of the same gene. Children from incestuous relationships also have an increased chance of congenital abnormalities, in addition to these problems. This is due to the fact that many of the genes that govern the growth of the body's organs and structures are recessive, which means that they only become apparent in the presence of two copies of the gene. Moreover, incestuous partnerships raise the chance of stillbirths and infant death. According to a 1970s Czechoslovakian study, infants born into first-degree incestuous relationships had a twofold higher risk of dying in their first year of life than infants born into unrelated families. It's crucial to remember that not every child born into an incestuous relationship will experience genetic diseases or other health issues. Just said, the risk is larger than for children of unrelated parents. We now have a better knowledge of the dangers of incest because to genetic science, which has reinforced long-standing social taboos. But it's crucial to keep in mind that genetics is only one component of the whole.
First state to be
The
settled
legal,
in
psychological, and
1607,
societal
Virginia
dimensions of
has a
incest
rich history
are all
and
equally
heritage
significant
for
and
visitors
intricate.
to delve into.
Due to the effect
While
of international
countless
human rights
Revolutionary War
conventions and
and
legal
Civil War
standards,
sites are scattered
incest legislation and social norms have become increasingly uniform throughout modern cultures. For example, the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child outline standards for shielding kids from incest and other forms of sexual abuse and exploitation. These rules have been adapted by numerous nations into their respective legal systems. These days, the majority of nations have laws specifically prohibiting incest, with penalties ranging from incarceration to the death sentence. The extent of forbidden kinship and the definition of incest, however, differ significantly between nations. Certain nations have laws against incest that also apply to marriage and adoption. Notwithstanding these differences, the taboo against incest continues to exist in many contemporary countries. The incest taboo is essential to preserving social cohesiveness and order in the framework of social organization. The incest taboo pushes people to develop alliances and ties outside of their immediate family by forbidding sexual contacts within the family, which fosters social integration and collaboration. According to anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, a basic component of human social organization is the ban on incest. In his hypothesis, the taboo against incest leads people to marry outside their family, which facilitates the exchange of women between communities and results in the development of intricate social networks. Intergroup connections are cultivated, and societal stability is enhanced by this interchange. Despite the increasing standardization of laws and societal norms against incest, several societies and communities continue to engage in incestuous marriages. Their religious convictions or cultural customs are frequently the source of these customs. For example, next-of-kin marriage is still practiced among Zoroastrians in Iran and India as a type of cousin marriage. In a similar vein, cousin weddings are another tactic used by many Middle Eastern royal dynasties to hold on to their position of authority. However, because of the influence of international legal requirements and society values, these behaviors are becoming less common. The rising knowledge of the possible hereditary hazards connected to incestuous relationships is also contributing to a decline in the acceptance of these practices by society. Today, incest usually occurs accidentally, among individuals who do not know about their close family relationship. History, however, provides us with the most examples of deliberate incest and shows us the variety of motives behind this socially undesirable practice. Thanks for watching. Remember to support our channel. Please subscribe.